So this is a follow-up on a previous video for multi-block relief, color relief, and achieving those multiple layers with multiple blocks, so as opposed to reduction. I've got my ink set up. We're going to do 3 blocks total, 2 color blocks and 1 key that is going to be printed in black. You can see I've got my paper here. I've got a printing area set up. I've got a jig. All of my paper has holes punched in it. I have registration pins. Here's a closer look at the holes punched in the paper. You can see that I wrapped the bottom corners with masking tape on both sides so that when I punch the holes punch very cleanly. You can see where it was just paper, it's not quite as clean. And actually the real danger is that without the tape, by going on and off the pins a number of times, that the holes will get wallered out and then the registration will be lost. So the tape is a big benefit, particularly when you're printing on very thin Japanese paper. And this is extremely thin and sheer Japanese paper. This particular paper has a really smooth side and a much rougher side. I'm going to do a print on each, but I'm going to start with the very smooth side. So setting things up, the first thing I have to do is I have to tape down the registration pins to the jig. You can see that the jig is nothing more than an L-shaped piece of wood attached to a base, a flat base, masonite in this case. One of the things I need to do is I need to decide what is the orientation of the block in the jig, and I need to be completely consistent about that as I go through the whole process. So I'm going to decide that the bottom of the image is going to be against the long side of the L, just like that. And I have a nice fit. So this is 90 degrees and this is 90 degrees, and so when it goes in, it's nice and secure. That's what's going to allow me to not only take this block out and replace it and have it be in the same place, but also have the other blocks. And it's going to be just as secure, and it's going to align with this. Also notice that the L of wood is not as high as the block itself. So this is just MDF, which is the same thickness as the particle board here. In my registration jig, if the jig itself is as high or higher than the block, I'm going to have a problem because I need to be applying pressure to the surface of the block. So if I were using unmounted linoleum, the jig could be something as simple as mat board, as long as it's cut in a good 90 degree and the block fits into it securely. So generally, if I'm working on unmounted linoleum or something thin, I'll just use mat board for this. So this would be mat board, as with this. The shop owns a few of these. We might be making some more. They live in the vertical slots right down here. So I pulled this one out. This one is called Wilma. It's got some old tape on it. I'm just choosing to ignore that. I won't need it, but so the first thing I need to do is I need to tape down my registration pins where the paper will go. And that can be a little bit of a challenge. I have set this up so that if I take a block and I just show you here, I've set it up so that I'm going to have 3-inch margins at the sides and the top and 4 inches at the bottom. So the bottom will be weighted. And then I added yet 1 more inch to the bottom because the holes are going to be ripped off at the end. So that's the orientation that it's going to go. And I need to match that orientation and those measurements here in order to tape down the pins. The way I do that is I'm pretty casual, but it works, is between the translucency of the paper and pressing down a little bit, I find the edge of the block and then measure to the edge of the paper. And I usually start with one side like that. So there's 3 inches. And now I'll do the same here. Pretty good. And I keep adjusting. And then I go to the opposite side. And then I'll do the top. I can measure down here, but provided I'm at 3 inches here, 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 and then twice here to make sure we're all parallel, so we're not skewing not going to make the image at an angle in relation to the edge of the paper. We're measuring those 3 sides, should be good. I might weight it down for that so that it's not going to move. And then I'm going to tape down the pins. Now when I tape down the pins, I can reset this, but by far the best thing to do is I set this now, and then for the duration of the project, these pins stay taped down to the jig so that I do not have to. What I'm going to show you today is printing all 3 blocks, one immediately after the other. So I will ink up all 3 blocks, and then I will print all 3 blocks on one piece of paper in quick succession. That's one option. That's printing wet onto wet, wet ink onto wet ink. Occasionally, you're making a print where the wet on wet becomes a little bit of a problem. The paper can only absorb or hold onto a certain amount of ink at one time. And if that's the case, if you start reaching that point, then you may want to let a layer dry before you print another layer. So you'd be printing wet on dry. If that's the case, you can use this exact same system to do that. The difference is that the pins need to stay taped down for a week, 2 weeks, whatever it is, so that 2 weeks from now, I can come back with the exact same piece of paper and put it on here and trust that the paper is going to be falling in exactly the same place, okay? So this system will allow you to print wet on wet or wet on dry. All right, so now our registration jig is ready. And notice I did all that before the ink was put onto the block. It's stained, but there's no ink there. Obviously, I wouldn't want to be pushing down on the paper if there was ink on this while I'm just setting registration. So that's why I did this step now, is that I didn't ruin that piece of paper. So now, moving over here, you can see that doing multi-block requires a certain amount of space. So I did my ink mixing over here. I've got my black reservoir of ink set up there, so I'll ink my black block there. I've got space here to do a blend for the sky that will be more saturated blue to less saturated, moving into white. And because I felt like I was running out of space on this tabletop, I set up my orange block, my 3rd block, over there. And we'll move over there when we ink that up. Now, of the 3 blocks, one is going to be a blend. That's the sky. So we'll start with that. This is going to be my roller, my brayer, for this block. Now, these 2 are just older scrap blocks that are the exact same height. Now notice that this block, there's a big chunk right here that's been carved away, and then I need this to print, and I need the whole sky to print. So as I roll ink onto this, one concern I have is that this area that I've carved away, that I don't accidentally tip the roller into that and deposit a bunch of ink and get tooling marks right there. And I don't have to worry about that with this side because this is all uncarved and that's going to print. I'm just worried about this. This I could sort of worry about, but because I have printing information here, image area, these two areas will keep the roller bridged so that it won't be depositing ink into this area. But I don't have a big chunk of image area here to keep the roller bridged. So I'm going to use this scrap block, or one of these scrap blocks, for that purpose. I think we can get away with just using one. And we're going to put it on that side of the block right there. So that as I roll this, once there's ink there, I will roll it like this. And that scrap block will keep the roller from depositing a bunch of ink into that. So if I want to blend for this, I want to go from saturated blue to less saturated blue. I want blue all the way across, but I want it to be a very discernible change in saturation. So I've got my saturated blue, and I've also got pure white. Now thinking through this, I know that I don't want pure white at the bottom. And I think the best way to do this will be to mix in a very small amount of blue to the white. I don't want a part of the sky completely with no blue. And you can see I've got quite a few boogers in the ink. The cans this morning, you know, they have not been used now for a while because of the break. So they had developed a lot of dry skin on the top, and that has left me with a lot of boogers in the ink. I will continue to remove boogers as I can as I'm rolling out the ink. So my favorite method to do a blend roll is to have the spot where I'm going to be rolling it out. So I'm going to roll it out here. My reservoir is going to be right there. And I'm going to take sort of a manageable bead of ink like that. And I'm going to try to carefully create a kind of pile of ink. Notice I'm just doing it on the right side. But I want to create kind of a nice pile, but I need it evenly distributed left to right. The hardest thing about doing a blend in relief is putting this ink down and getting ready for the reservoir. Because I don't want more ink in one spot than I have in another spot. So I need all of the ink left to right to be pretty uniform in quantity. And I might keep making adjustments as I go. Okay, let's try that. So you can see I've got this kind of pile there. It matches the width of the brayer. And so what I'm going to do is get the brayer right up to it so that it's touching the ink and bring it down. And I'll roll a little bit and get a little bit more and then bring that down. Now you can see I didn't have as much ink there in the center of my two piles, so I'm missing ink there. That's fine, I can work with that. I'm going to get a little bit more. Now I want this blend to be really slow. So I don't want to just keep the roller in one spot like this. Instead, I want to go side to side a little bit. So I'm going to move it about 1/2 inch to the left and roll. And then 1/2 inch to the right and roll. So the amount that I move the roller side to side while rolling out my reservoir determines the breadth of the blend. And that's looking pretty good. Now I need to also be thinking about quantity of ink. I need to be thinking about how much ink I'm going to need on the block at once. You know, there's a lot of image area on this block, so it's going to consume a fair amount of ink. Right now the reservoir is about the same size as the block, which means that I might have to start adding ink to the reservoir even as I ink up the block for the very first time. And the way that I'm going to feed the reservoir is by bringing the roller up, touching that ink, and bringing it down into the blend. So let's go ahead and start. Particularly at first, I don't want to apply a whole ton of ink to the block. I want it to build up kind of slowly. So there's noticeably less ink. Already, because so much is transferred to the block. Keep in mind that a block that you've just carved will have a little bit of saltiness to it because the linoleum has a little bit of a texture. That texture will be smoothed out by the process of printing and cleaning the box a few times. But your first few prints are likely to be a little salty just because there's that tiny little bit of texture in the linoleum, and that will go away. You don't even have to sand it or anything. It'll just go away from printing and cleaning the blocks about 2 or 3 times. So I think that one's ready. Why don't I go ahead and ink up my black now. The black is pretty straightforward. Now the black has a border all the way around it. So I'm not going to use a spare block to bridge the roller because I don't need it, because the border itself will be bridging the roller. And so I've got a roller that's just barely bigger than the block. I've got my reservoir all ready to go. And I'm seeing some boogers in there, so let's get rid of some boogers. If I need to, I can carefully scrape them off my roller too. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit already. Rolling up the black, I might roll in a few different directions, but I do not want to change directions while I'm in contact with the block, because that would push ink into my finer details. And I always want to finish with big, broad rolls all the way across to try to eliminate roller marks. Okay, there's the black. Now you can unplug there, Max, and we're going to move over here. Now with this one, we have a very small image area and a very large quantity of non-image area that's been carved away. So in this case, the danger that the roller puts ink into this area is pretty great. So for that reason, I'm going to have 2 spare blocks like that are right up against my main block. So, you know, sometimes I might have a little space there depending on if the image comes really close to the edge. But in this case, because the image area is entirely inside the block by a significant amount, my scrap blocks are going to be right up against there. So I've got my reservoir here. Yeah, I'll start with this, but I'm going to need more ink here in a second, but that's okay. I'm going to be careful that my block stays, or sorry, that my roller stays on both of these. I don't want to accidentally position it so that the roller is off one block. That's important. So I'm going to try to build up this ink a little bit at a time. I'm not going to try to throw all the ink at once at the block. So now I'm going to add a tiny bit more, just a little tiny bit to the reservoir. Even that out. Okay, and then give it a final roll. So because I'm using these 2 scrap blocks to bridge the roller, I have pretty good edge detail. So I've got the quantity of ink that I need, but it's not like I'm pushing ink into a bunch of carved out areas. So the clarity of the edges is really good. Okay, so we take this. You can go ahead and plug the phone back in there, Max. So now I have 3 blocks ready to go. For one print. Now in this case, because they're multi-blocks, the sequence of the 3 blocks doesn't matter too much. The key is definitely going to be printed last. But between these 2, the sequence shouldn't matter too much. If these overlap a little bit, it won't matter too much which is on which. So I'm going to go ahead and do the orange first. So it goes in, bottom of the image here, like I decided. It doesn't matter so much what I decide as long as I'm consistent and it's secure. My pins are secure, so I will take my piece of paper. I need to keep the paper away from the block until it's on the pins. So I'm holding it up. Once the paper's on the pins, I can just let it drop. I can start with my hand just to sort of attach the paper to the block using the ink as a little bit of a glue. I often will start with this part of my palm just to sort of initiate the printing. And in fact, even just using my palm like that will actually result in a fair amount of ink transferring, right? In this case, it's almost done. I'm going to finish with this glass Baron. I'm doing small circular motions. I'm not pressing super hard. I'm working more from the inside of the image to the outside. The paper cannot move while I'm doing this. If it does, I will screw up this print and screw up the edge definition. The trick is to be patient and to make sure you're covering the entire area. If you check and you still have significant parts of the image that are salty and you feel like you just need a little more pressure, you can use a wooden spoon and go in and more selectively apply pressure. Now, because this paper is so sheer, you really see it coming through the paper, which is helpful. It gives you a very good indication of where you've rubbed adequately and where you still need to rub more. Okay? So when you think that's done, then you can lift and just fold it over. Now that looks pretty good. So now I can take one block out and the next block goes in, the sky. Bottom of the image in the same place. Paper is on the pins. Using my palm just to kind of initiate the ink functioning like a glue to sort of hold the paper in one place. Then the glass baron, starting in the center, small circular motions, not pressing super hard. Flats are much more difficult in this method because if you're rubbing either with the baron or the spoon or the palm or whatever, if it is uneven across such a big flat area, then the marks from this will show. So if I peek at the print right now, you might see a difference. I'm not seeing too much difference actually, but you can see I've pressed more here than there. There's more saltiness there than there. Some of the saltiness I'm seeing there is due just to the texture of the linoleum itself. And some might be to not quite enough ink. But I think most of it is going to be due to just the texture in the linoleum. And so I'll see that disappear as I make a few proofs. It'll just smooth out. Just the process of printing and cleaning the block a few times will smooth out that little bit of texture. And then once it's smooth, then it's going to stay that way, probably for a lot more prints than you care to edition. So if we probably still got some saltiness, quite a bit. So if you're thinking that you need more, then I'll go in. The spoon is going to, because it's more focused, it's not as broad as this. So the spoon is actually going to apply more pressure. Not because it's harder, because it's wood and it's actually softer than the glass, but because it's applying the pressure in a more focused area. Which means that it will, yes, apply more pressure, but it'll also be more apt to leave a gesture in the print, because where I apply pressure with the spoon will look different than where I have not applied pressure with the spoon. So I'm doing this and trying to apply a uniform quantity of pressure, a uniform amount of time to each part of the image. Usually this is the moment in a demonstration that I start telling a few jokes, but because this is being recorded and put on YouTube, I'm going to refrain. So you'll just have to live with my silence for a few more moments. I'm almost done. Now if I were doing this other than as a demo, I might rub a little bit longer, but that's looking pretty good. I've still got some saltiness, but I think that saltiness, what's there is primarily there due to the fact that that block is new. And so I'm going to go ahead and call it done for this, but trust that in subsequent prints it'll get a little bit better. So now I can do my key. So that block goes in. Down goes the paper. Just getting it glued down with my palm. The way that I'm showing the printing of this now today, where I'm printing wet on wet, it works pretty good for most prints. But every once in a while, you've got an image that's got so many blocks that having all of them inked at once, having all of that glass surface that you're using, and all of that ink thrown at the paper at one time just becomes too much. And so if you just have a few layers and there is a minimal amount of overlap of the ink, the wet on wet will work. But at a certain point, you're just going to have to switch to printing wet on dry, which requires time, because you'll have to print a layer, maybe 2 layers, maybe 3, and then let those prints dry for possibly quite a few days. I am using the Cranfield Caligo Safe Wash inks. These are water cleanup, or soap and water, but they are very slow to dry. So if I really want to print wet on dry, I probably will need to allow the prints to dry for 2 or 3 days in the drying rack before I can print a subsequent layer. Okay, I think we're there. So, moment of truth. I'm going to pick up the paper from the pins very carefully. And there we are. I'll put it like this for you. So, assessment. I want the saltiness in the sky to be gone. So I need to print and clean the block maybe 2-3 times to get it to go away. I need less blue. So when I want to redo my blend, and I want this saturation of the blue to only be at the very top. I want to see this really light blue come up farther. So I'm going to redo my blend. I'm kind of wishing that I wanted the explosion here to look like it's, projecting warm light onto the buildings, but it looks a little off to me. So I'd love to be able to, maybe I can just, what I can do is, instead of a blend, I can just apply less pressure with my palm to here, and then apply lots of pressure on the back of the paper just there. and that will leave the orange very salty here and here, but not there. But that's the basics of doing this multi-block relief. I'm not going to demo in this video cleanup, but of course I expect whoever's going to be printing to do adequate cleanup of this. That's it.